BYJU'S is the story to talk about for all the right and maybe mostly wrong reasons, come to think of it. Things that it did well, it feels like it's been a while now that it's been not doing too well, either financially or when it comes to corporate governance or when it comes to its employees. But let's go with each of these one after the other. BYJU'S has been in the news for a lot of changes that happened at the management level solely on the back of the fact that their financials are still not looking very good. It's the end of 2023.
Right. It all began, I think, roughly when they acquired Akash, the coaching giant Akash, in 2021. And roughly from then on, if you take a look at the BYJU'S story, it has seen the rise. It's a classic case of the rise and fall of a giant. Once upon a time referred to as an edtech giant, not referred to as an edtech giant anymore, because right now all the talk is about the glorious fall of BYJU'S, to the point where at the end of the year in December, Byju Raveendran, the founder or the co-founder, had to pledge his own home to pay salaries. So that's where it ended. But what transpired in between is incredible, both in terms of people's awareness about what edtech as a product is, and in terms of also the startups and their own attitude towards building valuations more than building consumer and customer trust. And BYJU'S being a classic case of it as well. So from then on, if you take a look at it, a startup that was valued at once upon a time what is called as a decacorn, because it was valued at over $20 billion, $22 billion was how high the valuations one touched, and then it kept getting cut down and down and down to single digits, to the lowest possible levels. The fall of BYJU'S tells two stories. One is what is the potential of edtech in a country like India and how it changed from the pandemic world to the post-pandemic world. That was one story. And the other is how startups and startups' attitude towards building businesses, both. Because they say, the best of the startups in the country, say for a startup like, say, MakeMyTrip.com or something like that, they did the process of building it, scaling it up, considering all factors, considering people involved, considering the employees, considering the consumers. So BYJU'S, that's where the questions started being asked about, how did BYJU'S scale up so quickly based on the one simple idea at that stage that everybody's going to sit at home and give education to their children in front of a computer screen. From then on, you have all the global investors through the course of the year cutting down their valuations. One of the famous ones being the Dutch, Netherlands-based investor Proces, first slashing valuations down to about $5 billion based on the stake it has in BYJU'S. And then we saw one issue or the other, one litigation or the other, all the mass layoffs, and of course the famous videos of employees within BYJU'S asking questions to their supervisors and not getting any answers, that going viral. So it had issues with every single stakeholder concerned, from the investors into the company to the employees of the company, and of course finally the customers of the company.
All right, let's go to the start of it. Where did it all start? I think some can date it back to before pandemic, which is when BYJU'S was at the height of its glory. We had an edtech giant, an India company indigenously made popular for rolling out courses that people in India most wanted. The story of Byju Raveendran is both fascinating and questionable at the same time. At the height of pandemic, I think it was golden glory days for BYJU'S, where it saw its revenues shoot up, but goes away pandemic in 2022 and reality kicks in, and since then it hasn't been very well.
You're right. Obviously the pandemic, the fact that children were at home, parents were at home, schools were shut, education had to continue, edtech was the answer, and that answer came on the first tick. The answer that arrived for everybody was called BYJU'S. Now, what all did BYJU'S do? Obviously, it wasn't just BYJU'S that grew. Of course, BYJU'S grew the most. At 22.5 billion, it was the most valued Indian startup ever. Obviously, among the entire edtech pack also, it was the most valued edtech, right? But you also had Vedantu and Unacademy, PhysicsWala, so many of these startups mushroomed trying to get a piece of this, we thought, ever enlarging pie, but then we realized that the pandemic was thankfully short-lived. Now, with the pandemic receding, people taking their children back to school, schools reopening, this whole format of distance learning, computer-driven learning, edtech as a business proposition started attracting question marks. Now, in this whole course of becoming the largest Indian startup, what all did BYJU'S do? Krishna spoke, of course, about Akash, and Akash was this traditional tuition center, right? Coaching center for engineering students. Now, after the takeover of Akash, or around the same time, there were multiple other acquisitions also that BYJU'S was making. One among them was called Epic. The other one was called Great Learning. Now, while there was valuation, now what is valuation? Valuation is an investor coming in, buying a stake in your company for a certain value. But at some point, Byju Raveendran realized that perhaps let's not part with equity anymore. Let's continue to grow, but leverage ourselves and take a debt. And that became, I think, the first grave mistake. There was nothing wrong with growth, but then this leveraged growth, taking a loan of as high as $1.2 billion and then not being able to pay that loan back. That, I think, became the first nail in the coffin, if we can call it yet, for BYJU'S. Now, obviously, one thing led to another. Now, there are multiple battles that BYJU'S is facing right now. The topmost among them, and there's a priority list in early December, Byju Raveendran had chalked out this priority list, 5 areas that he really wants to tackle immediately. One among them, the topmost among them, are the FEMA charges, the exchange management and violations of India's foreign exchange management rules is the first and the foremost challenge that Byju Raveendran needs to tackle, because ED has gone after BYJU'S and accusing BYJU'S of not keeping up with the laws of exchange management. So that is the first challenge that Byju Raveendran has to tackle. The second one, of course, is repayment of this $1.2 billion loan. Now, this $1.2 billion loan will be paid perhaps in part by selling the platforms Epic and Great Learning, which were bought using that loan in the first place. But now it's a distress sale, so he's not attracting the same value for those platforms as what he bought them for 1.5 years, 2 years ago. So this is the second challenge he's faced with. The third challenge is really the financial reporting. So the financial reporting has not yet happened for FY23, and end December, we are at the end of December, right? And end December is when Byju Raveendran is slated to, or BYJU'S, the company, is slated to release its FY23 audited books. FY22 books came out in the month of November, first week of November, much delayed, 1.5 years too late. But when we saw,
by that time, the official auditor of the group, Deloitte, had quit and left the picture.
Exactly.
That's how bad things were.
Absolutely. And BDO came in as the new auditor. But yeah, so FY22 saw, while there was an exponential growth, 2.3x growth in revenue, losses had narrowed, but we were still looking at losses. The path to profitability was nowhere on the horizon. And FY22 is actually April 2021 to 31st March 2022. 2021, April to July, August, traces of the pandemic were still there. Complete reopening of the economy of the country, while in most parts it had reopened, but people had not ditched the online model completely. So to buy limited, revenues grew and profit and losses narrowed. But my fear is that FY23 numbers are actually going to be devastating for BYJU'S, because April 2022 to 31st March 2023, nobody has pretty much spoken about the COVID-19 pandemic. And online education was completely ditched.
Kids are back to school, people are back to colleges. So perhaps the story of edtech giants or edtech space seems flagelling at the moment.
Totally. So coming back to the priority areas for Byju Raveendran, the last in his 5 top priority list, the 5th one is actually at a corporate level, drawing a path to profitability. So it's pretty clear that profits are still elusive for BYJU'S. It is still, and growth, what we saw in FY22 is unlikely, that number is unlikely to make it to the books of FY23. And the problems began in FY23, which are now, and we are in FY24 right now, which are really going to get magnified, blown out of proportion for the books of the company in FY24. So it is obviously a very, very grim picture for Byju Raveendran. Now, obviously, he has been unable to pay salaries for the month of November, for which his own house, in fact, 2 of his own houses were put on the block, and they were mortgaged, and he had taken a loan to pay those salaries. Yeah, I mean, and he's sort of, he's considering himself as this warrior right now, battling multiple wars at multiple ends, 5 of those wars definitely that we spoke about, but really feeling like a war leader right now, wanting to emerge. Now, what also happened in the midst of all this was a complete board rejig. What also happened in the process of all this was Ranjan Pai coming back to the rescue of Byju Raveendran and paying another $600 million of loan that had been taken from Davidson Kempner. So there are these little, knights coming in their armors to the rescue of Byju Raveendran. Byju Raveendran feeling like a war leader right now.
And of course, the sale of Epic and Great Learnings, the acquisitions that didn't make sense at the beginning, it came a full circle by the end of the year, where it probably will raise about $400 million selling Epic alone.
Yeah, that's right. So I think all of these will go towards problem number 2, which is repayment of that loan. Problem number 1, which is FEMA violations. He's already said that, we've completely complied, there has been no problem, etc. But the problem is the path to profitability, and that seems to be one reason that what do investors want at the end of the day? To begin with, investors want you to grow like no tomorrow. BYJU'S has delivered that for the investors. In stage 2, investors want returns, either by selling their equity to somebody else who's out there to buy it, which seems unlikely right now for BYJU'S given all the corporate misgovernance in the company, and the path to profitability is still being elusive. So the second thing that investors want are returns on their investment by way of the company making profits and dividends, which are shared by all shareholders, and the bigger ones, including Prosus for that matter, not finding any merit in keeping a $22 billion asset on its books, reducing it to $8 billion first, 5.5 billion, and now it is at under $3 billion.
$3 billion. So path to profitability, perhaps that is what BYJU'S will be eyeing. But it's not just BYJU'S, come to think of it. There are other startups that are dwindling when it comes to financials.